Now it's time to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Michelle Leinfelder-Miles is the Delta Crops Resource Management Advisor serving San Joaquin, Sacramento, Yolo, Solano, and Contra Costa counties. She serves as a county director, overseeing University of California Cooperative Extension Programming in San Joaquin County. Today, she will be speaking on pest management in alfalfa, small grains, and garbanzo beans. So now I would like to pass it to Michelle. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. So thank you everyone for participating today. As Peter said, my name is Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, and I'm a farm advisor and county director with UC Cooperative Extension, and I'm based in San Joaquin County, which is right in the middle of the Central Valley, basically. Today, I'm going to be talking about a few different agronomic crops. So my farm advising responsibility is primarily in agronomic crops, so grains and forages. I do a lot of work in soil health, variety evaluation, some work in pest management. And so this is a talk that's going to talk about diagnostics, how to identify pests, how we can deal with pests using different IPM practices. So alfalfa, small grains, and garbanzo beans are the three crops that I'll be speaking about. But before we jump right into those crops, I'm going to do a little bit of background on what is IPM. So IPM is a process for solving pest problems while minimizing risks to people and the environment. IPM is focused on long-term prevention of pests, and it has an emphasis on pest identification and monitoring. So for several of the pests in these crops that I'll be speaking about today, we have critical thresholds for the pests. Some of the weevil and aphid species in alfalfa are pests that have thresholds. And so what we would do is use monitoring in the field to identify what pests are out there and what population density we have. And if we meet some critical threshold, that would be the indicator that we need to do something about those pests. Sometimes we can live with the pest. It's not reaching that critical threshold that would have an impact on yield. And so IPM is considering these different things. Can we live with the pest? And if not, how can we deal with the pest using different strategies? We may use a combination of techniques. These are listed there on your screen, like biological control, cultural practices, mechanical control, and yes, chemical control too. Pesticides are a tool of IPM, but pesticides should be used when monitoring indicates that they're necessary. And ideally, we're using pesticides that primarily affect the pest and minimally impact other organisms so that we're not, for example, impacting biological control agents when we're using a pesticide. We're focusing in on the pests that are a problem. Of course, in using pesticides, you must always refer and follow the label. The label is the law. Proper diagnosis is key to IPM. Again, monitoring, seeing what's out there, and then identifying the pest. So some of the problems in the field may be the result of something that's living, a biotic organism, but some of the problems that we observe in the field are non-living or abiotic. So we can look at whether there are patterns in the field, survey the field for different trends. If it's patchy, we may be able to identify a pest. But let's say, for example, it follows a straight line down the rows, then maybe that's the result of something management that we've done, a tractor pass or an irrigation practice that's impacted that strip in the field. When I go out and am working with growers in the field, I'm always asking a lot of questions, probably asking more questions than I'm answering. Things like, what was the field history? What are the conditions that led up to the problem that we're seeing? Has the grower or PCA implemented some sort of management practice so far that might be impacting what we're seeing? And then taking samples is always important. taking soil samples to see if there are any nutrient deficiencies or salinity that might be impacting the field. But taking plant samples, we have a diagnostics lab for diseases at UC Davis, our collaborator there. We're grateful to her work in the lab that we can send samples and get disease diagnostics done. But we also have an entomology specialist who we can work with to ID insect pests, and a cadre of weed management advisors and specialists who can help us ID weed pests. So really, with UC Cooperative Extension and the University of California, we have a team of people, a network of folks that we're bouncing ideas off of and asking questions and showing pictures to help our clientele properly diagnose problems so that we're IDing the right thing and managing for the right thing. So now let's jump into those 3 crops that I mentioned at the very beginning. We'll start with alfalfa. So alfalfa is a perennial crop that in California is typically grown for 4 or more years, which means that pest management is spanning several years. While the cutting cycle is generally during the spring and summer months, and that depends on where you are in the state, how long your cutting cycle may be, pest management decisions are made year-round because that crop is growing year-round. And because it can be anywhere from several months to several years old, pest management on the life of your alfalfa crop will change. So when it's a seedling crop, your pest management issues and attention will be something different from when that crop is, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years old. It's really important to think about pest management before you even plant an alfalfa crop. Pest management starts with prevention, and you're going to notice that this is kind of a theme that I use throughout for these 3 different crops that I'll be talking about. Pest management starts with prevention. So pre-plant considerations for alfalfa include site history. What was the crop or the pest history that you had in the field? It's important to try to monitor weeds ahead of planting the alfalfa crop. So even though alfalfa is generally a pretty hardy crop once it's established, the seedlings are actually pretty weak. And so it's important that we're managing weeds ahead of getting those seedlings developed, because the weeds may actually be more competitive than the seedling alfalfa. Land preparation should include preparing for good drainage and a deep root zone. But when planting comes around, you want to have a firm seed bed. That seed is planted fairly shallow for alfalfa, maybe only about a ½ inch deep. And so having a nice firm seed bed for that seed to establish in is really important. Variety selection is hugely important. It's one of the most critical decisions a grower will make with alfalfa. And there's a publication linked right there, which is a publication that I often refer growers to. It's from the National Alfalfa and Forage Association. It's a leaflet that names different alfalfa varieties based on their dormancy rating. And then the tables show a number of different pests and diseases that may impact alfalfa and the level of resistance that those different varieties have against those pests. I won't promise, I won't even pretend to be very fluent on genetics, but suffice it to say that the genetics of alfalfa is pretty complicated. And so even a variety that's highly resistant against a pest may actually have a seed, in your field, you could have as many as 50% of the plants of those seeds be susceptible to the pest that it says it's highly resistant against. And that's related to the genetics of alfalfa. So getting anything less than highly resistant varieties will just make you even more susceptible to the pests that you need resistance to. So highly resistant varieties is important if you know that pest has been a problem in the past in your field. We always say that seed treatments are a good insurance policy for alfalfa. So if you haven't had alfalfa in the field in quite some time, it would be a good idea to inoculate the seed with rhizobium. That's what's going to help your alfalfa form that symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that helps to fixate nitrogen. We generally do not recommend fertilizing alfalfa with nitrogen because it fixes its own. But perhaps if your field has not had any sort of legume or alfalfa specifically in quite some time, you would want to inoculate and maybe use a little bit of nitrogen starter fertilizer. We would also recommend using a fungicide seed treatment, especially if you have heavier soils where disease pests might be present. To ensure a good stand, our alfalfa specialist, well, emeritus alfalfa specialist now, Dan Putnam, did a lot of work several years ago looking at planting timing and found that planting alfalfa in the fall, roughly now, is actually a good time to get the crop established, get those seedlings to develop a good root system ahead of the most severe winter weather. Now, one might ask, how do I do that if it's dry? Well, obviously this works best if you have some way to irrigate, and the recommendation would be to irrigate with sprinklers so that you're not completely, destroying any soil structure or that seed bed where you've planted that seed so shallowly. This is not always a possibility for growers, and we recognize that. So we put it out there as a recommendation, and if it's possible, we welcome growers to give it a try. But obviously growers have a lot of things that impact their decision making, and planting this early in the fall may not always be possible. I've mentioned this before already, but you would want to plant fairly shallow, 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep, and roll the soil for good seed soil contact. Once those seedlings are established and have come up, you would be looking for 20 to 50 plants per square foot, and this would be about a month after planting. So that would be the stand that you would be looking for. And I looked over a couple of our bullet points, but seeding rate would be about 20 to 25 pounds per acre if you're broadcasting seed. And if you're drilling seed, you could probably reduce that to 15 to 20 pounds per acre. All of these are cultural practices that we would recommend to help prevent pest problems later on. Okay, so what are some of the pests that you might be experiencing or looking for to try to prevent, particularly now in the kind of fall and going into winter months? So you would want to survey your field for different weed species, and the most problematic weeds are those that would be toxic to livestock. So I've shown them, a couple of them here, groundsel in both the seedling and mature stage, and fiddleneck in both the seedling and mature stages. So these are the pests that you would definitely want to get a handle on, because if fed to livestock, these can cause problems. Oftentimes, if we can just get a dense enough stand, alfalfa stand, then we can shade out and choke out some of these weeds. So getting a handle on the weeds earlier on is definitely an important practice. Getting into, in my area, it's usually in January, the January timeframe. We would be monitoring and potentially treating for weevils. So you'll see a couple different weevil pests there, the adult alfalfa weevil and the adult Egyptian alfalfa weevil. We have good treatment thresholds established for these pests. And so off of the IPM webpage, the alfalfa webpage, you can find those thresholds and some strategies for monitoring them and determining if any sort of pest management practices are needed based on the population you find. The larvae, you'll see there on the right side of your screen, They will feed inside the stems, and the alfalfa weevil adults will feed on the leaves. So both stages are impactful to your crop. We can sometimes deal with weevil by cutting early. So it doesn't always require a pesticide application, for example. If we can afford to cut the stand early, then we can often reduce the population of this pest and perhaps prevent a need for a pesticide application later on. But generally around 20 larvae per sweep is what we would recommend. That's kind of the treatment threshold for weevil. And there are different pesticides that are registered for this pest. Usually, growers are using pyrethroids, but my colleague Ian Grettenberger has been doing some research on pyrethroid resistance in California and different parts of California. And I would recommend looking up his lab website because he talks a lot about where he's found pyrethroid resistance in California and what other pesticides might be options in the case of resistance. Other pests are aphid pests. So you'll see a few different types there on your screen. The blue alfalfa aphid, BAA, is identified on the left, followed by the pea aphid and then the cowpea aphid. The blue alfalfa aphid and the pea aphid look very similarly, you'll notice. However, the pea aphid has those black nodes, I guess you could call them, on the antennae. Why is this an important characteristic? Because the blue alfalfa aphid, as well as the cowpea aphid, they inject a toxin that can reduce the growth of alfalfa. And so if you see little green aphids out there, it's important to determine whether it's the blue alfalfa aphid or the pea aphid, because the blue alfalfa aphid is more detrimental to your crop. And therefore the treatment threshold would be lower, about 10 aphids. It would in a sweep for the blue alfalfa aphid. Sometimes the aphid pests are more of an issue on the border, on strips around the field. And so that might be a control method, is just treating on the border of your field, the exterior of your field, and maybe you can prevent a larger pesticide application across the field. And of course, I think any kid would be able to tell you that ladybugs or ladybird beetles are a predator of aphids. And so if you're discovering that you have a lot of ladybugs in your field, then that's a good biological control aphid, as well as the parasitic wasp that you see pictured on the right. So now some different disease pests of alfalfa. Now I'll just start off by saying, oftentimes we're not treating for diseases in alfalfa because it's not economical. Nevertheless, it's good to be able to identify what they may be. So you'll see stem nematode on the left. It's where the internodes may be shortened. Common leaf spot and stemphyllium leaf spot are pictured in the middle of your screen. Common leaf spot is usually just identified as these black spots on the leaves, whereas stemphyllium has that necrotic kind of brown spot in the middle, surrounded by black on the margin of that spot. And then Phytophthora can be another problem, particularly in heavier soils where it could be waterlogged. And so you may be able to mitigate some of the problems with disease with irrigation management or, say, a cutting schedule. All right, now for a little bit of interaction from you. This is an optional thing. You don't have to participate in this, but I think it can be a little bit fun to test your knowledge. So as a little bit of background, this is a field that I visited a few years ago, and it's an older field, about 4 years old. I went out there in probably the month of February. And the grower said it had always been a good producing field, but look at how it looked now. It was very patchy, a lot of what looked to be dead spots. These plants that you can see my hand there in the lower left, where the nodes of the plants were shortened. And so I was contemplating some different ideas as what this problem could be. The PCA thought it could be Phytophthora because, again, it was a little bit older stand, a little bit heavier soil. So what do you think this could be, given some of these clues? Feel free to put some ideas in the chat, and I'll just be quiet for a moment while you think it over and do that. Awesome. Great ideas coming through on the chat. Stem nematodes, aphids, hardpan, herbicide residue or toxicity, waterlogging issues, irrigation issues, maybe drought, because we have had some dry winters, haven't we? Root diseases, spray, fertilizer burn, lots of good ideas. All right. Okay, so remember, this was February, maybe March, but I think it was probably February. So I'm gonna give you another clue slide, and this is probably gonna give it away, but here we go. Here's my next slide. I took some samples back to my office, to my lab, and I cut up some of the crowns and the roots, put them in a petri dish with some water, and looked under the dissecting microscope. And this is what I saw. You'll see a big blue arrow in the picture on the left with some little squiggly lines coming from the roots and the crown. Nematode, worms. Yeah. Okay, so these are under the microscope, microscopic. So I would say leaning towards nematodes more so than worms. And let's go ahead and let's get that. Let's get some more info. Okay, so thanks for participating. That was kind of fun. And we'll do that again a couple more times. Stem nematode. Yes, those of you who guessed that, I would say you are correct. So alfalfa stem nematodes are plant parasitic nematodes, and they harm the plant by feeding on the roots and using their sucking mouth parts or their stylet. They feed on the stems or the crowns, and their symptoms may not necessarily be distinct, but like I said, you cut these plants up and put them in a dissecting microscope, and man, if it's a problem, those nematodes will start to swim out into the water, and it's a pretty easy thing to diagnose. For management, we recommend using highly resistant varieties. So again, I said at the beginning, you don't want to use anything less than highly resistant if you know you have a problem. There aren't a lot of other management practices for stem nematode, unfortunately. Sanitation is really important, or site selection if you know that you have fields with a history of stem nematode. Crop rotation, at least 2, maybe even 4 years or longer. But the good thing is that stem nematode is pretty limited in its host profile. So alfalfa, potatoes, and then there's another forage crop that's primarily grown in the Midwest that is a host. But a lot of the crops we grow in California would not be a host, and so rotating is a primary management tool. Nematicides are not registered, and so we would not have any sort of pesticide really as a recommendation. And overall soil fumigation for alfalfa is not considered economical. And so that wouldn't be a recommendation in this case or in many other cases, most other cases, I would say, with alfalfa. All right, small grains. Small grains in California include wheat, barley, oats, and maybe some combination of them together in one field. These are cool season grass crops, and they provide good rotation for some of our summer crops, like tomatoes or corn or beans, that are often grown in these annual crop rotations. They may be grown with or without irrigation, and these small grains may actually become a strategy in California for optimizing land management and crop yields, particularly in areas where water is limited or where the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is preventing the use of irrigation water in times of drought. Small grains may be grown for grain or for forage. And so there's perhaps a little bit different consideration for pest management depending on what they're being grown for. I won't go into too much distinguishing those two in the next few slides, primarily because, again, like the alfalfa slides, I'll be talking primarily about what pests to keep an eye out for. Okay, and pest management starts with prevention. Again, this is kind of a theme throughout. So for small grains, we would recommend that you use certified seed. Some growers will save seed as part of their management because it's a way to save money. However, it could be risky if there are pests that impacted the field in the past and you're saving those seeds because some of the diseases are seed-borne. And there could be an issue with saving seed if there were a lot of weeds in the previous field, and your seed lot could have a lot of weed seed. So certified seed would help prevent those problems. We do have a variety selection tool. Mark Lundy, the small grain specialist, has put a lot of work into this variety selection tool, which is linked on your slide. And so you can go there and get tables of our variety trial data from across California, up and down the Central Valley, even down to the Imperial County region and up to the Intermountain region. So that's the thing about small grains. They're grown literally up and down the state. And so you can get results for different diseases that have impacted small grains, including stripe rust, barley yellow dwarf virus, leaf rusts, and septoria. Cultural practices are pretty important with small grains, again, because the economics may not be there to buy pesticides and apply them for some of these different pests. So crop rotation may be important in managing some of the pests that may impact small grains. And fallowing too may be an issue, or it may be a management practice and may become a little bit more of what happens in times of drought. Sanitation practices like cleaning equipment before changing fields, considering what your irrigation water supply is. If it's coming from a dairy, for example, lagoon water may have weed seeds or nematodes in it. And so consider that and in your overall pest management strategies. And then keeping your field borders clean of weeds is pretty important. I know that can be really challenging. Man, you drive along any road, it seems, and there's fleabane going to seed right now. And so I recognize that that is not always easy, and you can't control your neighbors and you can't control state highways. But do what you can to keep your field borders clean of weeds. And then, of course, just like alfalfa, establishing a good stand is a critical step. And so leveling your field to keep water distribution even is important. And then we, as a small grains work group in Cooperative Extension, we've done a lot of work looking at fertilizer applications and using nitrogen-rich strips in your decision making. So what does that mean? It means you would apply nitrogen fertilizer in a sufficient amount in a strip or in a small zone, but you would do that just in that small area and not across your whole field at the beginning of the season. And then you would use that nitrogen-rich strip to monitor the health in that strip and help you determine whether nitrogen fertilizer was even necessary in the rest of the field throughout the season. So you would use soil samples. You would use plant monitoring to determine, to compare between the nitrogen sufficient, the nitrogen rich zone, and the rest of the field. Do you notice differences in, how green the plants are, or do you notice a difference in your soil nitrogen results? So that's a way to kind of help you determine, optimize the health and fertility of your crop without spending money when you don't need to. And then sowing dates can make a big difference. So I know in my area, we're generally planting small grains in early November. Anything earlier than that can make your crop more susceptible to diseases. Anything later than that might mean that it gets oversaturated and the stand doesn't establish very well. Surveying your field for weeds is always important with all of these crops. And so trying to establish a good vigorous stand to outcompete some of these broadleaf and grass weeds. And that's a challenge with small grains, right? They're grasses, and some of the most important or impactful weeds are also grasses. So I point one of them out here on the slide on the right with the the orange arrow. Italian ryegrass is, well, it's the bane of small grains, and it's probably the bane of a lot of crops in California right now because it has developed herbicide resistance, and it's becoming increasingly hard to manage. Italian ryegrass has resistance to ALS and ACCA's inhibiting herbicides like Osprey and Axial. And so there aren't a lot of strategies to minimize the problem, but being able to identify it and hopefully manage it before it gets out of control is important. And rotating herbicides, what few herbicides we have, is really important so that that resistance doesn't develop. Here are some of the insect pests that impact small grains. The bird cherry oat aphid is probably the most impactful. But just like in alfalfa, there's an aphid that transmits a toxin, and that's the one pictured with the orange arrow, the Russian wheat aphid. And so that's another one that you'd want to keep an eye on. Other pests may include mites or maggots or wireworms, and even some of the worm species. Diseases can be a challenge in small grains because there aren't a lot of tools in the toolbox for small grains. So getting out there and monitoring them, looking at planting highly resistant varieties where those exist is really important. We are currently working on updating the IPM guidelines for small grains, including the disease IPM guidelines. And so keep a lookout for those in the near future. But again, pesticide applications may not be economical. And so using cultural practices like variety resistance is incredibly important for small grains. All right, here's an optional quiz your knowledge. So this is a problem that I encountered in the field, again, probably a few years ago. You see these irregularly shaped lesions on the leaves, and then you see them also on the grains. And then you see some of the zoomed in images with these black spots. These are called pycnidia. They're a type of spore on the leaves. And they can reduce the photosynthetic capacity of the leaves. So that's how they're impacting the small grains, as if they become these lesions become so spread out over the leaves that it impacts their photosynthesis. And it's especially a problem if it impacts the flag leaf, which is that top leaf next to the grain panicle. This can be a problem in my area in fields where they've planted a little bit early. So the plants are, maybe the seed is planted in late October. The seed leaves come up, but then they have this long kind of fall period and winter period where they're not growing a lot, but they're out there susceptible to the environment, the weather. And so it can be a little bit more of a problem in earlier planted fields. Looking to see if we have anything in the chat. Yeah, we've got a few ideas. Anybody else want to throw something out there? We've got septoria, we've got rust, leaf blotches, maybe powdery mildew, all good ideas. I think everybody's honing in on disease. I think I gave it away with the word spore. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click through. I'm going to give you the answer. Good ideas there in the chat. Okay, this one's septoria. So this is a foliar fungal disease. So good job, those of you who picked Septoria. It occurs in high rainfall years or when rains impact that flag leaf. The spores, so this is a problem with Septoria. The spores they can travel over a long distance. And so there's really, it's hard to manage because the spores are floating all around and you can do your best, but they may blow in from your neighbors, right? And those spores could germinate a few weeks later. So it's hard to pinpoint infection sometimes. And then, like I said, it can be more problematic in earlier plantings in my area, like in late October, because it exposes the seedlings over a longer period of the winter. But it can reduce grain yield by preventing that grain to fill. So it is a problem that growers need to pay attention to. There aren't a lot of management practices, but again, certified seed, finding resistant cultivars, trying to manage residue or volunteers, that could be another strategy. Again, the spores travel a long distance. So crop rotation isn't really a good practice because you may rotate, but your neighbor may not. But planting a little bit later, maybe in November, can help reduce that window of time that the seedlings are exposed to spores, but not actively growing and kind of establishing their root system. Fungicides may work. They are a tool, but they may not be economical. So keep that in mind. All right. And garbanzo beans. So garbanzos are not widely planted as much anymore in California, but there's a team of us in Cooperative Extension that are working with Christine Diepenbrock at UC Davis, who is the dry bean breeder for lima beans and garbanzos. We're doing some variety evaluations, and she's got some good material in the pipeline. So we're hoping that maybe in the next few years, we can release some new varieties with good environmental good performance across different environments in California, as well as disease resistance. So garbanzos, again, are an annual cool season crop, and they're generally planted in December through February in the Central Valley. They're a legume, so they could be a good rotation crop with small grains, right? So a lot of times growers are planting small grains year after year after year, or winter after winter after winter. Maybe garbanzos can kind of fill a niche where you're rotating out of grains and you're putting in a legume to break up disease cycles or to fix some nitrogen. They're less reliant on irrigation than other warm season bean crops. So all the other bean crops that I named, limas, also black eyes, they're all summer bean crops. And so garbanzos kind of fill a niche of being a winter crop. And as I've already said, they provide an alternative to small grain winter rotations. Some of the pest prevention strategies include site selection, keeping the cropping history in mind. If you've had a summer bean crop, it might not be the right decision to follow with garbanzos. Some of the diseases and pests are selective to just garbanzos, but some of them may not be. And so it's not advised that you would plant a summer bean crop and follow it with garbanzos. Soil drainage is pretty important with garbanzo beans. Heavier soils may lead to damping off diseases or other root diseases. It can also inhibit nitrogen fixation. And then also keeping in mind that garbanzos are susceptible to alfalfa mosaic virus. So if you have alfalfa nearby, some of the insect pests may be flying between fields and they could transmit that virus. So we wouldn't advise putting garbanzos immediately next to alfalfa. Ascochyta blight is an important pest, an important disease of garbanzos. There is some variety resistance. Fusarium wilt is less widely spread, I would say, but has been observed both along the coast and in the Central Valley. There is disease-resistant varieties for both of those. Unfortunately, there isn't variety that has resistance to both of those. So that's something that needs to be worked on in the future. Of course, using certified seed with no visible defects is really important. My colleague Rachel Long reminded me that a few years ago in the Yolo County area where she worked, there was a kind of freak summer rainstorm around Memorial Day, and it dropped like inches of rain. And what happened was the beans were still in the pods, and they took on some of that moisture and actually started to germinate. And then they harvested the beans after they dried out, and the dry bean, when it was used for seed, you couldn't see the cracking. You didn't notice that the beans had cracked and that little radical had started to emerge, because those beans were green when that happened from that freak rainstorm. But then when those beans were used as seed, and they didn't notice immediately that cracking, it just resulted in seed that didn't germinate very well and a reduced stand. So making sure you're looking at that seed and making sure there's no visible defects is really important. Treating seed for diseases is an important strategy, because there aren't a lot of other pest management or pesticide options. So seed treatment would be something to investigate. Inoculating with rhizobium for garbanzos is also important to ensure that crop is going to fix nitrogen. Garbanzos do fix nitrogen, but they don't fix enough to serve their growth and yielding needs. And so nitrogen fertilizer as a supplement is still needed, usually between 60 to 100 pounds. And then earlier planting can result in denser canopies that result in more disease growth in the canopy later on, like in the late winter, early spring. So maybe a little bit later planting would be advised, especially if you know you have disease in the field. One of the challenges with garbanzos is that you have to manage both winter and summer weeds. They have a long growing season, and so you see some of the weeds that can impact garbanzo stands, including mustards, like in the wintertime, all the way through to pigweeds and lamb quarter in the summertime. Pre-emergent herbicides are really important because there aren't a lot of post-emergent options, and broadleaf weeds can be the most impactful to garbanzo stands. Tillage and crop rotation are important, and I've already talked about crop rotation, but obviously without a lot of herbicide options, tillage may be an important part of your weed management program. Garden symphyllums and wireworms. So I know it shows a carrot, but if you look really closely, there's these little orange worms coming out of that carrot. That was a trial where we were kind of seeing what the wireworm pressure was. So we put the carrots in the field, and then we went back about a week later to see, how heavy were those carrots infested with wireworms before we put in a trial. But anyway, those are a couple of pests that can impact garbanzos, particularly in kind of the late winter, early springtime. And then these are some of the diseases that may be observed in garbanzos, some of which I've already mentioned: alfalfa mosaic virus, the ascochyda blight has those circular lesions, which can be on the leaves. They can also be on the pods. And so it looks pretty similar between the leaves and the pods. White mold can happen if you've planted early, and that dense canopy can result in all that mycelial growth down around the crown. And then fusarium wilt, it's not super common, but it has been observed. That's where you see the inside of the root gets darkened. That's it's the xylem tissue that's impacted, so it's not able to be used as a conductive tissue anymore because the disease has impacted and killed off that xylem tissue. Okay, here's another little quiz yourself. If you want to put some ideas in the chat, you'll see some garbanzo plants there that kind of range from a nice green color to a light lime greenish yellow, and even some totally dead plants or parts of plants. This was a field, again, I visited a few years ago. The grower observed that some of the plants, the older leaves would start to yellow and then just totally dry up like that and die off. It was most impactful on the older leaves, but eventually even the younger leaves, in the worst case scenario, that whole plant would just dry up and die down like that. The grower was pretty concerned because he has limited options. He doesn't have a secure irrigation source for this field. And so a winter crop was one of, he was really relying on being able to grow something in the wintertime and wanted to have something to rotate with small grains, didn't want to have to grow small grains back to back. All right, root rot, fusarium wilt, wireworm, water stress, white mold, verticillium, lots of ideas. Lots of ideas. Lots of fusarium wilt, okay. Good ideas. All right, now you'll see in the left side, the picture on the left, and this is actually a photo from a publication. I did not take this photo, but it represents what I needed to represent. So you'll see that dark tissue on the inside of the root, inside the xylem tissue. So the one that's circled in the blue oval, that's what we're representing when I took these plants back to the lab and opened up the roots. That's what I observed. You'll notice that the middle picture there on the left has the darkening on the outside of the root tissue. That would be the phloem tissue. And then the right side of that smaller inserted picture shows a perfectly healthy root, no dark discoloration. So it's the left side where it's dark in the middle of the root, that xylem tissue that's deadened off. That's kind of the clue that we're looking for. All right, so kudos to everybody who said fusarium wilt, also known as fusarium yellows. So this is a vascular disease. Again, it impacts the xylem tissue, and it begins as this yellowing, and then it completely wilts and the plants die off. It could be mistaken for alfalfa mosaic virus, but mosaic virus usually has that kind of mottled look on the leaves. Again, the fusarium wilt is going to have that dead xylem tissue inside the roots. So you really, even though what you're observing in the field is the leaf tissue dying off, you got to dig up plants and open up the roots, because sometimes those leaf symptoms are a problem with the roots. So fusarium wilt will reduce yields, both the seed size and the quantity. And while it's not considered super common in the Central Valley, that field that I visited was in the Central Valley. But not to scare anybody, I haven't had too many calls about symptoms like that in garbanzos. So not to alarm anybody, but just to kind of put it out there as almost maybe a curiosity, or just to kind of broaden your horizons and keep it in mind when you're out scouting fields. Management, there aren't a lot of options, but it is a pathogen that's crop specific, and it will only impact garbanzos. So yes, there's fusarium wilt for other crops, but this pathogen is specific to garbanzos. It can survive a long time in the soil though. So for this particular grower, there weren't a lot of options for him. And that's why it was really important to diagnose this. There is a resistant variety, UC27, and so we would certainly advise growers to use that variety if they think they've might have a problem. And of course, equipment sanitation is always a good consideration for any sort of disease, including this one. So I know I'm running up on time, and so I'm just gonna show a few pictures of abiotic disorders. I do this just to kind of help you when you're out there in the field and you're thinking about things. Not all problems are living organisms. Sometimes they may be water stress, they may be heat stress, they may be frost damage, they may be salt, they may be fertilizer, too little, too much. So these are just kind of a smattering of photos that I've taken over the years to represent some of the abiotic disorders, and looking for those patterns in the field, or patchiness versus patterns. Those are some of the things that are going to help you when you're out there scouting or trying to determine what the problem is. So to summarize, IPM focuses on long-term prevention of pests and their damage. It's a year-round thing to keep in mind. Best management practices can change over the course of a season or over the life of the crop. Keeping in mind that diagnostics and monitoring are critical to IPM to make sure you know what disease or pest you're dealing with. You're looking to see if there are critical thresholds for treating that pest. And then you're using a breadth of strategies from cultural practices through chemical and biological practices to help manage pests. And I want to acknowledge UC IPM for text and photos that were used in this presentation. For more information, there's the IPM page that you may want to reference in the future. And with that, I thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to Peter to make any announcements.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Excellent presentation, a lot of information.
Happy to help.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michelle. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.